Retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, the third longest serving justice in the history of the court, died tonight of complications following a stroke. He was 99 years old. Justice Stevens was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1975 by Republican President Gerald Ford. He served on the court for 35 years. Although a registered Republican, Justice Stevens often sided with the liberal wing of the court. He insisted that it was the court and the Republic. It was not him, but it was the Republican Party, not his views, that shifted over time. He supported a woman's right to choose an abortion. He voted to reinstate the death penalty, a decision he later said that he regretted. During the Clinton presidency, he led a unanimous court in ruling that a sitting president could face a civil lawsuit while in office. He offered a blistering dissenting opinion to the court's ruling in Bush versus Gore, which decided the presidential election in 2000. He retired in 2010 at the age of 90 and was awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Obama, the country's highest civilian honor. But he remained active in his retirement. After the mass shooting in Parkland, Florida in 2018, Justice Stevens called for the repeal of the Second Amendment. And last year, he called then Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh unfit to serve on the Supreme Court. In a statement tonight, Chief Justice John Roberts said, quote, Justice Stevens devoted his long life to public service, including 35 years on the Supreme Court. He brought to our bench an inimitable blend of kindness, humility, wisdom, and independence. His unrelenting commitment to justice has left us a better nation. Joining our discussion now is Neal Katyal, a former acting U.S. Solicitor General and an MSNBC legal contributor. Neal, we feel especially lucky to have you tonight. You actually argued cases in the court and argued cases to Justice Stevens. Your reflections tonight on his career.
Well, I think, Lawrence, all of us in the Supreme Court bar are heartbroken, and I think the Chief Justice captured the man well. I mean, I had the privilege of arguing, I think, over 24 cases before him, and every single time, it was always the same thing, like ask just a couple of questions to us. They were always the devastating ones, the ones that you really practiced and hoped no justice would ask. And he was just a towering intellect and a prince of a man, just the politeness, the courteousness, and the diligence and the nonpartisanship way in which he approached the job. When people think of the rule of law in this country and going back and the phrase in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 that we are a government of laws, not of men, that describes Justice Stevens. And
he was a Republican, but he did not like what he saw Republicans do in recent years. He said the Senate absolutely should move on the confirmation of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court in the last year of the Obama administration.
Yeah, I mean, it's a striking thing to see the news tonight, Justice Stevens, the horribly sad news about his passing, at the same time as the House has voted to condemn the president for his racist tweets. I mean, Justice Stevens really was a proud member of a Republican Party that stood for something, that stood for American values, that stood for decency and respect to all. And I think you just see with a vote tonight, like the party moving in an absolutely different direction. And, you know, my hope is that people, all Americans, will reflect on Justice Stevens' legacy and realize that, you know, there are fundamental values to this country, and you can disagree with people on the left or right, but we have to treat people civilly and equally, and that's what his entire life's work was about.
A justice's career has both ruling opinions and dissenting opinions, and his dissent in Bush v. Gore is one of the most memorable that most of us have ever read. He wrote, although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. That was a very tough experience for him and others on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and also as litigants, I was one of Gore's lawyers in that case, and it was heart-wrenching to see the decision come down. And for every loss that Justice Stevens had, he had a number of enormous wins. But the very first case I argued in the Supreme Court, Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, in which I represented actually Osama bin Laden's driver, Justice Stevens wrote the opinion, cast the deciding vote to say we have to protect the constitutional rights of people, even at Guantanamo, even accused of doing the worst crimes imaginable. And Justice Stevens himself, he served in the Navy. He understood the values that this country stood for, including the Geneva Conventions. And so, again, it's just a really important lesson, particularly at this juncture in time, to think, there are things, principles, and important points that transcend left versus right. Justice Stevens stood for that.
As is perfectly appropriate for this program, Neil Katyal gets tonight's last word on Justice Stevens. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Neil. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.